which is TZAAAR BAALEI, the topic of prohibition against torturing animals. That's literally what it means. TZAAAR BAALEI, it's causing pain to living things. So we're going to talk about today the different ways we know this from the Torah, because in the Torah you have 613 mitzvahs, right? You have 613 commandments. The Torah itself doesn't say, here's commandment number 1, here's commandment number 2, it doesn't say that. So there are scholars who go to the Torah and they list all 613. Now, you're not going to find anywhere in the Torah it says, the Gemara tells us the 613, we have by tradition, the Gemara tells us there's 613. And therefore there are scholars after the Gemara's time who went through the Torah to find 613 and they identified them. Now, none of the 613 are, thou shalt not torture animals. It doesn't say that. But there are many mitzvahs that the Torah does say, and those mitzvahs tell us to treat animals properly. And from there we derive that it's a biblical prohibition against torturing animals. So to make that clear, it's not one of the 613 mitzvahs, but at the same time, it is still a biblical commandment, at least according to most opinions. Following? Yeah, so let's see. We're going to look at the Gemara now. So the first thing we look at the Gemara. The Gemara actually has almost a page and a half going back and forth. Is the prohibition against torturing animals biblical? It's in Baba Metzia. Or is it rabbinic? Is it Rabbanan or Deraita? It's a back and forth in the Gemara that goes on for almost a page and a half. We're not going to learn that whole thing. We're just going to look at a number of different scholars that came after the Gemara, which quoted different psukim, and they said, this is where I think it comes from. But first, let's see what the Gemara itself says, at least as an introduction. So this is Gemara in Baba Metzia, Lamed Beis, Amud Aleph, which says like this. Mitzvah Martyred lifleik avaloi litan. It's a mitzvah to unburden, to unload an animal that has a heavy load, but it's not a mitzvah in the same way to help somebody else load up their animal if they needed help. Following? Yeah. So why would it be a mitzvah to unload? Why would it be a mitzvah to unload? What? Because the animal is suffering. So this is already the first place where we see this idea. Torah says, treat animals properly. You see an animal that's carrying a heavy load. So you have to unload the animal. You have to unload it because the animal is suffering. So the Gemara explains it this. My avoloi litain. Why would this text say, why would the Mishnah say that unloading the animal, to load up the animal, to help the person load up the animal, why would he say that he's not supposed to do that? Should you suggest that it means you don't have to help the person at all? There's a pasuk which says help the person unload his donkey, and another pasuk which says help him load up his donkey. So why would the Mishnah say that one's a mitzvah, one's not? The Torah says both. Following the question the Gemara asks, the Torah says to help the person unload the animal, and the Torah also says help somebody else load up his animal if you see the person needs help. So why would he say it's not? Ella rather, seemingly it's the same thing. Well, loading up is not stopping the, is not for. No, there's two separate things, because unloading the animal is not just a question of helping the person, the owner. It's also a question of helping the animal who's suffering, right? But loading up the animal is not a question of helping the animal. It's a question of helping the owner, right? So there is that difference. But the Torah says to do both, right? So it says the Gemara like this. It's a mitzvah to help a person unload his donkey for free, just because the animal is suffering, so unload the donkey without asking for any pay. But if somebody needs help loading up his animal, you can charge him. So you want me to help you? No problem. I'm helping you, not the animal. I'm helping you as a person. So you want my help? No problem. Charge me. Pay me for my time. Right. I would think so, because that's a good question. Why getting a mitzvah for getting paid? So maybe it's because you're actually allowed to deny service, right? Someone says, can you please sweep my house for $20? You didn't have to say yes. But if a person comes to you and says, look, I need my help. I need your help loading up my donkey for $20. Can you say no? Torah says you have to. So you have to, but for pay, which you can charge. So you still get a mitzvah, because ordinarily you're allowed to deny services. Someone's offering money for you to do something. You don't have to say yes. But in this case, you have to say yes, because the Torah says you got to load up the animal. Following? That's one opinion. But Rabbi Shimon says, even unloading the animal should be done for free. I'm sorry, even loading up the animal is for free, just because you have to have love of your fellow Jew and help him without charging. Tanina Laha, it's also been taught, Tanarabana for our sages taught, Prika, Bechinam, Tina Beschar, Shimon, Omer, Zubazi Bechinam. Okay. So here we see a dispute between Rabbi Shimon and the other sage as to whether or not you are allowed to charge to help someone to load up their donkey. But they both agree that if the animal is suffering because it's carrying too heavy a load, then you must go help even for free. The question is only when you're loading up, can you charge or not? Is that clear? Okay. So it says the Gemara this later in the page, Amar Rava says, and then it goes to the next page, from both of these opinions, we see that the prohibition to make sure that animals are not suffering is a biblical commandment, because even Rabbi Shimon, which says that you're allowed to charge to help someone load up the animal, it's only to load up, but to unload, everybody agrees has to be for free. That's because it's a mitzvah to make sure that the animal is not suffering. This is what Rava says. And this begins a 2-page discussion. That's what I wrote on the bottom of page 1. The Gemara continues, back and forth, aruka, at length. Ilav. Is it biblical or is it not biblical? But the Gemara doesn't actually leave any conclusion. It just goes back and forth. Proof this way that it's biblical, proof this way that it's rabbinic. Proof this way it's biblical, proof this way it's the rabbinic. It keeps on going back and forth. So, what is it? Is it biblical or not biblical? So now we have to look at the scholars from the book, from the Gemara that came after the Gemara, right? Because the Gemara itself doesn't leave a conclusion. The Gemara gives both opinions, right? So we have to look at the scholars that came after the Gemara and see how do they conclude, and where do they get the idea that it's a prohibition. And the truth is, the majority say that it's biblical. It's a biblical prohibition against torturing animals. TZAAR BAALEI is a biblical prohibition. And we're going to see now a number of different ways to come to that conclusion, right? So the first is Rashi. This is Rashi in Shabbos. And he says like the TZAAR BAALEI Daraisa, he quotes the Gemara in Shabbos, which quotes one opinion that says that TZAAR BAALEI is biblical, Daraita. Look on top page 2. And Rashi says, Shenemar Ozev Tazev Imai. Because the pasuk says you got to help the donkey who is an extra load. And the Gemara, which we just read before, understands that why is it that you have to help the donkey unload? Because it's a mitzvah to make sure the animal is not suffering. So this is Rashi. Rashi says, what's the source? And what's the biblical commandment that makes us know, that informs us that you are obligated to make sure animals that aren't tortured? What's the source? Source number 1, because the mitzvah is to help animal to unload. And the reason for that is to make sure that the animal is not suffering. So from here we know you have an obligation to make sure animals not suffering. Clear? You can't charge, for sure you can't charge. The only question is if you're allowed to charge for loading up. But unloading, for sure you can't charge. Right? So this is, you have to help the person unload. You have to stop and help the person unload. There's all kinds of details about that, but you have to. You see an animal suffering, you have to go stop and help. That's what it seems like. It says, even if someone you don't like, actually the pasuk says that straight up, even if you don't like him. You see the donkey of someone who you hate, says the pasuk. Still, you got to go help the donkey because the donkey is suffering. What is the donkey's problem because you don't like the guy? Donkey is suffering. Animal suffering, go help it. That's source number 1 in the Torah for this idea. No, you have to do it for free. So this is source number 1 in the Torah for this idea of TZAAR BAALEI. Okay, number 2.
What if he asks you,
Sorry, say again? Do you have to refuse payment? I don't know. But you certainly have to do it without pay, even if he doesn't offer. Good question, I don't know the answer. Okay, next opinion here. Shit Mikabetza says, Shit Mikabetza wrote, Lebab Metziel Amabeis, Beshamai Ritva. Okay, so it's the Ritva being quoted by a commentary called Shit Mikabetza, which says, Nidr Meloshan Rashi, it seems to me from Rashi's reading, the Mishum TZAAR BAALEI Daraisa, Bahalacha L'Moshe Messina. You know what Halacha L'Moshe Messina means? What does it mean? Tradition. It means, so the Ritva is saying, even though we read Rashi before in Shabbos, which says that the source for TZAAR BAALEI is the fact that you have to unload the donkey. Here, the Ritva said that it seems to me from Rashi that it's actually a tradition that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And that's why it's not explicitly stated in the Torah. The reason why it's not listed as one of the 630 mitzvahs in the Torah is because Hashem gave it to Moshe Rabbeinu by tradition, and Moshe Rabbeinu taught it to his student, to Yeshua, who taught it to his student, etc. There are many things in the Torah that are halach l'Moshe Messina. For example, the fact that your tefillin are black and that they're square doesn't say anywhere in the Torah, and it's not derived from anything the Torah says. But it's a tradition that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So it says this opinion, that it's a tradition that goes all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, who got from Hashem. You're not allowed to torture animals. And therefore, there's all kinds of mitzvahs about not torturing animals. But the essence of the prohibition, the essence of the mitzvah to make sure you're not torturing animals, comes as a tradition back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Not if it's torturing it. I don't think so. But we're going to learn more as we go. Maybe tomorrow we'll get to that. We'll see. But I don't think so. Okay, so that's opinion number 2. Now we have opinion number 3. So you have 2 opinions so far where TZAAR BAALEI comes from. Number 1, you have a commandment in Torah to unload the animal. That's source number 1 for not torturing animals. Source number 2 is this opinion that says it's a tradition back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Now we have the Meiri, who writes like this. And that which we see in our Mishnah in the Gemara, which we read earlier, that the Torah says the Torah is more strict about making sure to unload an animal versus loading up the animal, right? Because when it comes to loading up the animal, we had at least one opinion which said you're allowed to charge, whereas unloading the animal must be for free according to all opinions. So from the fact that we see that loading up the animal is not as strict and not as important as unloading the animal, so we learn that there's an important mitzvah that we are prohibited from making sure animals don't suffer. And this comes from the Torah. Always, that you always have to make sure animals don't suffer, not just a question of unloading the animal when it has an extra load. Now, even though if you read the actual psukim, the psukim do not make any difference between unloading and uploading. It's only the Gemara which makes this difference. But from the fact that the Gemara makes this difference shows us that our sages, at least, see it more important to unload an animal, because the animal's suffering, more than uploading the animal, which is just helping a person. Whereas unloading is helping a person plus saving the animal. Nevertheless, says the Meiri, I do have a source in the Torah for this idea of making sure animals don't suffer. Right? In other words, the Meiri is saying, if you're just going to look at the mitzvah of unloading the animal, that's not a good enough reason to prove that there's a aveda, there's a sin to make animals suffer. Why? Because if you just look at that mitzvah, you would say, well, it's something as uploading, unloading. It's just a question of helping the person. Right? So who said it's about the animal? The Gemara tells us it's about the animal. Because the Gemara says unloading is more important than uploading. But the Torah itself doesn't say that. So how do you know from the Torah itself that you have to make sure animals don't suffer? So it says the Meiri. For our cost of the Torah says, the Pedish explicitly, Leisachsim Shor Bedishay. What's Leisachsim Shor Bedishay? So look at the next text in page 2. This comes to the pasuk in Devarim, which says, "You shall not muzzle an ox while it is threshing." You know what that means? When an ox is dragging a thing, it's like this little board that has little blades under it, and you stand on it, and the ox pulls it, and when the ox pulls it, and you're standing on this board with the blades on the bottom, the blades make cuts in the ground, and use that to plant your seeds. Okay, that's people used to use oxen to do that. Now the halacha is, the Torah says, "Leisachsim shor bedishay." You should not, right? That's what threshing is. You should not, right? It says you should not do that. One second. Separate grain from it. Okay, it's a little bit different. I'm sorry, it's a little bit different. One second. It's actually a little different. Threshing is actually, it's at the end. Sorry, they used to do that also. They used to have an ox to make things down. That's not threshing. But here, threshing is at the end when it's ready. You have to separate the grain from the kernels. So you do the same thing. You stand on that board and have the ox walk around on the kernels, and then because of the pressure that you're putting on the kernels, the it pops out. It separates from the skin around it. And the bottom line is you can't do that with the ox. Well, the ox has a muzzle. Well, the ox has something covering its mouth. That's torture. Making them walk on this food and it can't breathe. It can't eat properly. So in order to do that, you have to let it be able to nibble on the food that you're going around. Yeah.
Animals can sweat.
Would they have a muzzle?
They breathe heavily. The dogs do.
That's what it is? Maybe. The bottom line is, we see from the Torah that there's a prohibition against making the ox suffer. And that's what the Me'idi says. So this is source number 3 for not torturing animals. Number 1, the mitzvah says unload the animal. And the Gemara says unloading is more important than uploading because unloading has torture. Number 2, the Ritva, which said that a tradition go back to Moshe Rabbeinu. And number 3, the Me'idi says it comes from the fact that there's an Aveda. You're not allowed to make the ox work threshing while he's muzzled because it's torture to the ox. Yeah, what do you ask?
So we're not making the animals suffer, but when you kill them,
We're gonna get to that. Good question. What about eating animals? We're gonna get to that. Okay, now this comes from a book called the Sefer Chayyim. It's a very fascinating little piece here. It says like this. So first he quotes the Gemara, which is like this. Parek Vav de Brachas, in chapter 6 of the Gemara and Brachas, Amar Rav Yehuda Marav, bottom of page 2. Rav Yehuda said the name of Rav, Asal Adam sheyitam klum, it is forbidden for a person to eat anything, koidim shitam machal bahemta, before he feeds his animal. If you own chickens, you own cows, you got to make sure that they are fed before you eat breakfast. Shenemar, as the pasuk says, v'nosati eiseh b'sadcha l'vamtecha. The pasuk says, Hashem says, I'm granting you grass. Hashem says, I'm going to bless you. And I'm going to grant you grass for the animals in your fields. And then the pasuk says, and you shall eat. And you will be satisfied. And the pasuk says, you'll thank Hashem. So, when the pasuk describes it, first it describes your animal eating, and then it describes you eating. So from here we learn, you're not responsible. So from here we learn that you're responsible to make sure you feed your animal before you feed yourself. So says the Sefer Chayyim, why? TZAAR BAALEI, because it's torturing animals when you're not feeding them. And therefore, if the Torah tells you that you have to feed the animal before you eat yourself, then kolshken, much more so, that it's absolutely forbidden to actually use your hands to make an animal suffer, yeah? Okay, so you can't go and actually make another animal suffer using your hands, but you're not necessarily responsible to feed every animal in the world.
we're talking about feeding this one. I know. The ones that
Like to feed stray animals? Oh, if someone gives you their cow and says watch it for a day, you have to make sure that they eat before you eat yourself, probably.
A guy.
Yeah. He forgets, but he has to make sure the animal feels. Let's see what happens when you forget. We'll see. Okay. He forgot to do a mitzvah. We're going to see in a second. Watch something interesting story here. Okay, so it's a mitzvah to make sure your animals feed before you, because otherwise it's torture. And we see all over many places that is. So if the Torah tells you have to make sure your animal's fed before you eat, then certainly you're not allowed to use your hands to, God forbid, torture an animal. And if we see in many places that the Gemara says that the right, that's even biblical. We saw before from different mitzvahs, we prove that it's a biblical commandment. Now it says the Sefer Chayyim like this. And there was a story in our generation. Sharav Makubal, the known Kabbalist, Hagadol, the great Kabbalist, Kvod Marenu Harav Reb, the holy Rabbi Yitzchak Ashkenazi. Who's that? Garizal. His family name was Ashkenazi. Or his family came from Ashkenaz. I'm pretty sure the family name was Ashkenazi. So in our generation, says Sefer Chayyim, so now we know that Sefer Chayyim lived and where he lived. The author of this book, he lived in Svas, same time that Garizal did. So the story goes like this. That Garizal is stakel b'fnei Talmud Chacham echad. He was looking at the face of one of his students, one of the scholars. And Garizal told him, Nirshim b'fanecha, I could see on your face, avoin tzar balachayim, that you did the sin of torturing animals. Garizal could see this on his face. So this scholar, this Talmud Chacham, Start to feel terrible. I never tortured an animal. But if the Arizal said that I could see in my face that I tortured an animal, so I started to check, investigate, like what's going on in my house. Is there some animal that I'm hurting? Like, what, am I walking down the street? Like, what am I doing? What's going on? So I started to find out, start doing investigation. Until he found he found out that his wife wouldn't feed the chickens the biker in the morning. He would let the chickens go into the yard or go into the street, and they would pluck whatever they found in the street. So his wife wouldn't feed the chickens they had. She would let the chickens roam, and that's what they would eat. So and then Siva, he told her, and encouraged her, to make for them like a bowl or something, to have bran, to have water that they can eat properly. Okay. After he fixed the situation, made sure his wife is feeding the chickens properly, and the Arizal didn't know what happened. The Arizal looked at the guy's face, and he sees, I can see on your face, the Aveda of Tzar B'Chaim is gone. The Arizal had no idea what he did. Amaloi, so Arizal asked him, so what happened? Because Arizal said, I saw yesterday, or whatever it was, I saw a while ago on your face that you had a sin on your face, I could see that you did an Aveda for Tzar B'Chaim. And now I see sometime later, the Aveda is gone from your face. What's going on? So the student told Arizal, what happened? You told me that I have a sin of Tzar B'Chaim. I trying to find out what's going on. I found out my wife doesn't feed the chickens properly. She lets them roam to eat. I told my wife to feed them properly. She did. And that's what happened. And Arizal says, now that's why the sin is gone from your face. Imagine that. Talking about a real tzaddik. You can see in someone's face a sin. Amazing. The nida, shezel. Now, so where does this come from? It says the nida, it seems to me, she's an unaf in mitzvahs v'alachta b'drachav. This mitzvah of not torturing animals is an extension of the mitzvah which says you should follow Hashem's ways. What does it mean to follow Hashem's ways? So, Parashu, the Chachamim explained in the Sifri, Mahu rachum, atarachum. Just like Hashem is merciful, you have to be merciful. The Torah says to follow Hashem's ways. How do you follow Hashem's ways? Hashem is kind, you be kind. Hashem is merciful, you be merciful. So it says, that Hashem is merciful. Right? The Pasuk says in Tehillim about Hashem, Hashem is merciful to all of his creations. So if Hashem is merciful to all of his creations, and we are supposed to copy Hashem, therefore what? We also have to be merciful to creations. So now we have a fourth reason and a fourth source for the mitzvah of TZAAR B'Chaim from the Torah. Number one was because Torah says to unload. And the Gemara says unloading is more important than uploading because unloading is torture. Number two, an opinion that says it's a tradition that goes back to Moshe Rabbeinu. Number three, it comes from the mitzvah which says you have to feed your animal before you feed yourself. No, I'm sorry. Number three said it comes from the Aveda, which is in order to make an animal work while he's muzzled. That's source number three for not torturing animals. And source number four is what? Torah says copy Hashem. And Hashem is merciful, you also have to be merciful. Which tells you how important TZAAR B'Chaim is, making sure not to torture animals. It's not just a regular mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of copying Hashem or connecting to Hashem. Following Hashem's ways. One of the ways we follow Hashem's ways is by being merciful to animals. So if you were to hear this now, hunting for pleasure, you think that's allowed?
Yeah,
hunting for pleasure.
No, but why not?
Torturing animals. You're supposed to copy Hashem and be merciful. You think you'd be so if it's eating is something else, we'll get to that in a minute. We're gonna get to eating in a minute. We're gonna get to eating in a minute. We're gonna get there. But let's finish with this. So I don't think so. We still have 3 more sources for TZAAR B'Chaim before we get to the details of eating and all that stuff.
But all the animals you said so far are animals that belong or are mine or belong to other people.
That's true, but we derive from the fact.
We're already deriving from a derivative.
No, the Torah says to treat your animals properly. So we derive from this. You have to treat your animals properly.
Your animals properly, or his animals.
Yeah, but okay. So that's a good point. But what about this? This last one is the most straightforward. Copy Hashem. Hashem is merciful to all of his, to all creatures. You have to be animal. You have to be merciful to all creatures.
But you're already deriving that.
That's how Torah works. You derive from what Hashem says to figure out what Hashem really wants. That's how Torah works.
We're deriving again from the
That's how Torah works, from the derivation. You derive from derivations, absolutely. Right? You're constantly analyzing the Torah to see what Torah really wants us to do. That's how Hashem wants it to be, right? That was the first class we gave. Okay, now here comes an interesting question. Ready? So, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, famous scholar. So someone sent him a question. It's on the bottom of page 3. Shilas, Misha Megadol Chatul Akelev. The Seich basis, someone who's raising a cat or a dog in his house. Is it forbidden for me to eat before I feed my dog in the morning? Good question, right? Because we said before there's a mitzvah to feed your animals before you eat yourself. So does that mitzvah apply to dogs and cats? So he goes on for, we're not going through the whole entire write-up, his response, but he goes through back and forth why you would say yes, why you would say no. For example, it's possible that the mitzvah to feed your animal before you only applies to behema, not a chaya. You know what the difference between a behema and a chaya is? Behema and a chaya. 2 Hebrew words. Behema is a domesticated an animal, and a chaya is a beast, right? And it's possible that the mitzvah to feed your animals only applies to behema, not to chaya. So he goes back and forth. Is a dog a chaya? Is a cat a chaya? Or is it a gnat? Or is it a behema? And then he goes to other things, like for example, yeah. And then he goes another thing. For example, he says it's possible that the obligation to feed the animal before you is only if the animal has some use to you. It works for you. And then he goes, well, maybe dogs work for you also because they guard your house. And maybe cats also work for you because they get rid of the mice in your house. So it goes back and forth. And then he says like this. Ella butts at the end. Yearly, it seems to me on top page, it's page 4. It seems to me, says Yaakov Emden, af became less. Feeding an animal, feeding your dog and cat before you eat yourself is not the same as obligation as feeding your cow before you eat yourself. Or even a small animal, sheep, which isn't working for you necessarily, you still are obligated to feed it before you eat yourself. Nonetheless, listen to this, even though it's true that the obligation to feed your cat and your dog before you eat is not an absolute obligation, the same way it's an obligation to feed your cow or your goat or your sheep before you eat yourself, but nonetheless, the obligation to take care of your dog is still in this category. Why? Because the main reason why you are obligated to feed your animal before you, because TZAAR. Oh, now we have another source for TZAAR. We said before one reason TZAAR is unloading the animal. Number 2 was a tradition. Number 3 was the fact that you're not allowed to put a muzzle on the ox when it's working. Number 4 was you have to copy Hashem. And now we have number 5. It comes from the mitzvah that you have to feed your animal before you feed yourself. Okay? Now ask a question. Go ahead.
So back to the deriving question,
Yeah.
I don't get how it makes sense. It's like you say hi to me.
I'm not going there right now because it's a very long and complex answer. And we spent the first class we did here, we did an hour answering that question. How derivations work. I'll send you a video. You can watch it if you want to answer the question, but it's not for now. But it's a good question, and it's a very fundamental question. It's an important question to know the answer to, how we understand how Torah derivations work. And we did a whole share on it, and I'll send you a video. Okay, so let's see. But then the Yaakov Emden says like this: Why is it that you are obligated to feed your animal before you feed yourself? Because it's TZAAR BAALEI, because it's torturing animals if you don't feed them, right? But why is it torturing animals if you don't feed them? But you're still torturing them because they're waiting for food. It's the morning, they're expecting food, and now they're waiting for you to eat. So it's a kind of torture, at least for those 20 minutes that they're not eating, right? But
if you think about it, if you eat early and they're not even awake yet, so
still, the Torah says you have to feed them first.
I know, but you have to just wake them up.
No, so you put the food out for them, and then you can go eat. So let's see. But it says the Yaakov Emden like this. What's the real reason why it's torture? Because these animals are relying on you. And therefore, Unless they have an absolute schedule where you feed them every morning at that time before you eat. Thomas Berav, even in Yom Kippur you have to feed them. Thomas Berav, they will die of starvation, or you prepare the food before. Yeah, you still have to feed them, right? It's just a question, even before you eat. For sure you have to feed them when you're not eating. Even when you're not eating. But when you eat, don't put your food before the animal. Right? So, but Yaakov explains, what's this mitzvah come from? The mitzvah comes from the fact this animal relies on you. And because the animal relies on you, you have to have a schedule for its eating. So it says in Torah, the schedule for the eating that the animal is going to have is going to be to eat before you eat. Because if not, Thomas Barav, the animal is going to die of starvation. Because nobody's feeding the animal. The gam, animals don't find their, the cow or the sheep unless you put it there for them. They're not going to be able to find their own food. Therefore, Torah gives the man obligation, that these are his animals, to feed them before he eats himself. Why? So that he can acquire the character of mercy. It teaches you pity. So besides, in other words, you were asking, why can I make the schedule that he eats every day right after me? Right? Says Yaakov, and then first of all, you have to have a schedule for your animals. Okay? So you can make your schedule anytime. But Torah says, make this schedule of when you feed your animals to be before you eat. Why? Because that way it's going to teach you to be more merciful, to be more compassionate. By you feeding the animal before you eat yourself, it teaches you compassion. Now, he says, skip the parentheses there. Now, the Yaakov says like this. Hold on a second. If the reason why I have to feed the animal before me is because the animal is relying on me and I have to give it a schedule for feeding, what if the animal doesn't rely on me? I own an animal, it doesn't rely on me. It eats on its own. Then am I obligated to feed it before? So it says the Yaakov, but these, the dog and the cat, they can eat anything. Animals and cats eat whatever they can. Dogs can jump in the garbage and find food in Bagara. Some they bite bones. The kalba, and the Gemara said that an animal, if it's so hungry, if it gets to the point of starvation, it'll eat even that which comes out of a person's body. In other words, it'll eat anything. Dogs will eat to survive. Likewise, a cat. It has food available to it. Wherever it goes. Cats eat lots of stuff. And the cat will be just fine eating the leftovers you eat. Anything that you throw to it, it's going to eat. And also eats by catching mice. A dog doesn't even need to eat a lot at all. Like it says, the Gemara says, Hashem knows the dog that doesn't eat a lot of food. And therefore, even if you do give animals food, which you should, your dog, you shouldn't give them too much. The Gemara asks, how much food does a dog need to eat? And the Gemara says, measure the size of its ear, that's how much food it needs. Dogs eat very little. I'm sure you know this. You put dog food, it's not like you have to give them a massive whole steak. They have little bowls with maybe that's treats. I don't know exactly how you have to feed dog, but the Gemara says it's not a lot. So therefore, says the Yaakov Emden, the obligation to feed your animal before you feed yourself may not apply completely to your dog and cat. Because dogs and cats aren't relying on you like the goats, cows, and sheep are. And because they're not relying on you, maybe you're not obligated. Right? Follow what he's saying? Because dogs and cats are more resourceful. They can get their own food. And they don't need so much. Nevertheless, someone who wants to be a good Jew and wants to be extra careful, he should feed his cat and dog before he feeds himself. Isn't that amazing? So Yaakov Emden is saying that even though it's true, maybe the mitzvah to feed your animal before you feed yourself, it doesn't apply to dogs. But first of all, the mitzvah to feed your animal before you feed yourself is all about making sure your animals aren't tortured. TZAAR BAALEI. It's the mitzvah to make sure animals aren't tortured. It's part of that mitzvah. That's where it comes from. And if that's the case, certainly you should make sure to take care of your dog and cat. Even though I can't say you're absolutely obligated to feed your dog and cat before you eat yourself, like you are obligated to feed cow or sheep, But nonetheless, it's probably best that you do. It's pretty cool. Okay. Time is it? Okay, let's do the next piece also.
Which one?
Next two more pieces. We'll finish this up and we'll continue tomorrow. Okay, so next thing comes from the Sefer HaChinuch. You know what the Sefer HaChinuch is? It's a book written in what? It's the last page, page 5, top of the last page. Sefer HaChinuch is a book written somewhere in the golden era of Spain, and it's written by a father who wrote the book as a bar mitzvah gift to his son. Bar mitzvah gift to his son, isn't that amazing? What did he write for his son? He wrote an explanation for each of the 613 mitzvahs. Remember I mentioned before, the Gemara tells us the 613 mitzvahs. Torah didn't tell you what's a mitzvah and what's not. So you have to be a scholar to go to the whole Torah and find out how you get to 613. So one of the people who are the scholars who did that is the author of the book called the Sefer HaChinuch. So over here, he's talking about the mitzvah of shechita, the mitzvah of slaughtering animals. And he says, so look at the second line. And the Torah says also, al tzad pshat, on the simple level, ki mitzvah shechita, that the mitzvah of shechita, he for the same reason, which is not to eat blood. Because when a person cuts from the throat, that's when most blood comes out. And therefore we're told that before we eat the animal, we should use to shchita. That's when a lot of blood's going to come out. And that way we won't eat the soul with the flesh, right? The soul of the animal is in the blood, and by shechting the blood comes out. Okay, that's one reason. Now he says, another reason for shchita, that it should be on the neck, and by a thin, sharp, tested knife, not to torture the animal more than necessary.
So us, we don't do it like, I think we don't like torture it 100%.
We don't torture the animal at all.
Yeah, like,
So what's the reason for shchita?
so we cut it like at the certain spot that won't hurt.
That's what he's saying. We cut it in the spot that it dies instantaneously.
And also like,
And it almost doesn't even feel it, because it's such a thin knife and it's such a perfectly sharp knife, right? If the shochet has to test the knife using his finger like this, using his nail, and if he feels a bump, the knife is not kosher, because if there's a bump, then the animal's going to feel a bump and it's going to be painful. That's what he's telling us. That's what the chinuch is telling us. The reason why Hashem told us to do shchita is because we want to avoid the pain. Sorry? Yes, on a bird also shchita.
Why did the funny?
They did shchita with a nail. They did. That they had to make their nail long, and had to make the nail very, very sharp to make it like a knife. That was halacha. And then the bird that they used to do this shchita with a knife is a very small bird, so it's very easy to do it. No, you can't do that. That's torture. Has to be shchita where there's no torture. Now, the question is, if the point is not to torture animals, then don't eat them at all, right?
You go fishing?
Right, that's a good question. 1 second. So, if it's a question of making sure not to make the animal suffer, why eat it at all? So explains. Torah allows man to eat even animals, so that he can elevate the food and use it for his needs, not to just torture it for no reason. So let's explain this for a second. Remember, we learned in Tanya that when a person eats, if he has in mind that he's eating this because he wants to use the energy to serve Hashem, then he elevates the food, and the food gets served. The food becomes part of his service of Hashem, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's the question: If we're saying the Torah says not to torture animals, and that's why we have shechita to make sure the animal dies the most painless way. There's no extra pain, right? So it dies instantaneously. It doesn't feel it because it's so quick and it's so smooth, right? And the only reason why you're allowed to kill it at all is the Torah lets you eat it, which means every time you eat an animal, if you're eating it for selfish reasons, the animal's almost looking at you and saying, why did I die? For what? So you can be more selfish. So you have an obligation to the animal you're eating to use the energy that the animal is giving you for a good purpose. If you don't, then it's almost as if the animal died for no reason. In other words, really, we should protect the animal's health because we're not supposed to be torturing animals. The only reason why we're allowed is because Hashem says, okay, Hashem wants you to eat properly so you can live healthy. But why are you eating properly and living healthy? So you can serve Hashem. And that way you're going to elevate the animal too. And if you don't do that, you let down the animal. The animal died for no reason, just so you can have a good time. Following? It's not kosher. Okay, it wasn't on purpose. You tried not to. It happened, and you give the animal to a non-Jew. That's not kosher. So the answer is yes, but not for sport. Only if you're going to be eating. Okay, accent and accent. But you know what? I should say that everything I got here today is from this book. Right? The Mishnah says, whoever says something in the name of somebody else brings what's it called? So let's see. Yeah. It would seem to me that TZAAR BAALEI. It would seem to me, off the top of my head, fishing for sport, I don't think is something that a person should do. I think it should be only for eating or for making a living, not just stam because your own pleasure. Right?
What if you catch a whale for oil?
Okay, and there's some use you're getting out of it.
I want to kill the bird
You get some use out of it. If you get use out of it, then again, same thing. Are you using that oil for serving Hashem? Or are you using oil for your own pleasure? If you use it for your own pleasure, then what did you kill the animal for? If you're using it to serve Hashem, now you elevated the animal. Sorry? For? Yes, if you're using it for mitzvah, it's good. Okay, let's do one more thing. One more text. What? So let's do one more piece here. The Mishnah says in Shabbos like this: Beshamai ein shoydin yoyv saminon v'chashinim el kadesh yishru b'oid yoyim. In order to make you can't soak ink and different things on Shabbos because over Shabbos, if you put it on Friday to let it soak in water, over Shabbos the liquid becomes a dye. In other words, you're creating like a paint, but by letting it sit in water. The Beshamai says you can't do that. Beis Hillel says you're allowed to. Now, why does Beshamai say you can't? Why does Beis Hillel say you're allowed to leave these things to soak over Shabbos? So it says the Martyred, commentary on the Mishnah. Beis Hillel Martyred, mishnit in a mind as long as you put the water in before Shabbos, even though the water is sitting there with all of the ink and everything else to soak it up over Shabbos. The svili, because they say al shvisis behema adam muzar. Torah commands you have to make your animal rest on Shabbos in order to work your animal. Beshamai says you have to even rest your machines, not your machines. You have to even rest your kalim, your objects. So I own the ink here. I'm letting it sit in the water, and it's working over Shabbos on its own. Beshamai says you can't do it because you're making your kalim work. You're making your utensils. You're making your property work. Beis Hillel says you're allowed to make your property work, like this ink that's soaking up over Shabbos, but you're not allowed to make animals work on Shabbos. Why? Because that is torturing animals. So according to Bartanura, the Bartanura is a commentary on the Mishnah. Sorry? Ovaji de Bartanura. Bartanura is a place, actually. The person who came from that place. Sorry? No, you're not allowed to. That's what we're saying. Why can't you? Yes, they also have to have Shabbat. Why? So explains the commentary of Bartanura, the reason why the animal has to rest on Shabbat is because it's torture to make it work so much. You got to give it a day of rest. You need a day of rest, so does your animal. So this is already, how many sources do we have so far for not torturing animal? 6, 7? Yeah. Number 1 was unloading. Number 2 was tradition from Moshe Rabbeinu. Number 3 was the muzzle. Yeah. Number 4 was copying Hashem, because Hashem is merciful. Number 5 was feeding the animal before you feed yourself. Number 6 was shrita. Right? Yeah. Shrita. The reason why I have to have shrita is because of that. And number 7 is Because Shabbos, if to make the animal rest on Shabbos. So even if you want to say each of these are a problem, this is not a good reason because of that. It's not a good reason that. The fact that there are so many things in the Torah which tell us to treat our animals properly is itself enough for us to understand that from Hashem's perspective, He wants us to treat animals properly. In fact, there's even a question about zoos. About zoos. A zoo. Z-O-O, like a zoo. Trapping an animal for your own amusement. There's questions about it. I'm not saying you're allowed or not allowed. I'm telling you as a fact, this is something that's discussed. There's Chivot about this. There's other questions about just looking at animals, another question. I'm not saying you're allowed to or not allowed to. Oh, are you allowed to kill an animal for its misery? That's something I want to get into. But let's see, it's right here. Are you allowed to kill an animal to put it out of its misery? And you actually are supposed to. I'm pretty sure you even have to. Sorry? That's a different story.
Why?
Because life is life.
Let's see back in the day, the wars. I was fighting with my sword.
Sorry?
I got 3 swords to my chest. I'm still alive and coffee on my blood. I'm not going to survive because I know better back then. That's the way to stop me.
No, by Torah law, you're not allowed to do that.